for the Fairwork team. So Fairwork is an international action research which is led jointly by Oxford Internet Institute and Visibi Social Science Center at Berlin. What we do is we basically work on accountability in the fair and in the digital economy space on certain principles we have designed. So fair pay, fair working conditions, fair management, fair representation, and most importantly, fair working conditions as well. So based on these principles, we evaluate companies, we assess companies, and try to come up with a score. And using that score, we try to lobby or push the companies to make pro-worker changes. So in the last 6 years, Fairwork has assessed more than 826 companies across 41 countries. And all of these assessments have eventually led to more than 427 document changes. And these changes have impacted millions of workers across the world. So it's a pleasure to welcome you all here to the panel discussion titled AI's Labor Problems, Standards for a Planetary Labor Market. Now, we have been talking about AI since last, I would say, almost 5 years, more frequently than ever. And we have often discussed about innovation, productivity, and geopolitical competition. However, much less attention is being paid on who are the people that are defining the AI, the invisible labor behind it, data laborers, data moderators, data annotation workers. And mostly AI works across borders, so these topics are very less frequently discussed. What we would also like to understand is why labor concerns are increasingly evoked by AI governance debates. They are often framed around annotation and job displacement. The labor embedded within AI supply chain themselves, who are moderating the content, who are doing tasks of annotation, they are less frequently talked. So today's session will be focusing on few important topics. What does it mean to govern labor in the AI supply chain? Can standards and certification meaningfully allocate responsibility in a planetary labor market? And most importantly, how do we move from aspiration to consequence? So the entire session is divided into two parts. The first part is about Fairwork. We will be introducing the Fairwork certification scheme. And the second session is about is a panel discussion where we have panelists from industry as well as academia. So before I start the presentation for Fairwork, I'll quickly introduce Mark Graham and Patrick. Mark is the professor of Internet Geography at University of Oxford and also the director for the Fairwork project. We also have Patrick, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the Berlin Social Science Center, and he leads the Fairwork certification schemes along with the Fairwork Germany team. I'll request Mark and Patrick to take over the stage now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Manzo. I'm Mark, and this is Patrick, by the way. So good afternoon. Now, you know, most people, when we're thinking about AI, most people who use AI don't really have a sense of the enormous amount of human labor that went into making that thing, went into making that product or service. And so what we're here to talk about are the jobs and the huge number of workers, human workers, that make AI possible. Patrick's reminding me to move the slide, and I'll do that. So thanks, Patrick. So what we're here to talk about is the fact that all of this human labor within the supply chain, it's traded within a global production network. We're here to talk about the fact that the workers who do these jobs are mostly based in poorer countries. We're here to talk about the fact that these jobs are mostly extractive, exploitative jobs. But what we're also here to talk about is how we might move towards a fairer, more equitable, more just future of work. So I've spent the last almost 2 decades studying the outsourcing of jobs. And so for anyone interested in this, I've published a lot of that research in this book that you can see on the screen there. It's about all of the hidden human labor in AI supply chains. If anyone wants a copy, just email me. I'll send you a copy, happy to. Now, these jobs, they're very simply not good jobs. And I've put some of the harms that workers experience on the screen here. There's no time to talk about all of these things. But instead, let me just give you a quick story, a quick anecdote from what things are like from a data labeling center that I visited last year in Southeast Asia. So the workers at the center, what they were doing is they're training an AI for a large online shopping platform, a large online marketplace. What the workers have to do is they're given 2 images. image A and image B, and their job is to say whether it's the same product or a different product. Blue bucket, red bucket, different. Blue bucket, same. So they have 15 seconds to do each one. And they do this all day, 8 hours a day. Strict time limit, everything they do is monitored, everything they do is tracked, everything is logged. And because of that, the slowest performers, who are slower than their peers, are dismissed. They cannot continue doing that work. Now, the problem is this interface that I'm describing where the workers have to do this, it didn't display a timer. So what do the workers do? Well, all of the workers, they get out their phones, they set a 15-second timer so that they know that they can stay on track. Now, imagine being in a room of 300 workers, all of whom have a timer on every 15 seconds. There's bells, there's alarms, there's sirens. For some reason, a lot of the workers had a chicken squawk as their alarm, so there's chicken squawks everywhere. I'm in this room for like 10 minutes, and my head is throbbing. Imagine being in that room for 8 hours a day, every day, with this din of noise. Now, this is by no means one of the worst issues that I've seen. I've seen all kinds of places, and this is not even close to the worst that I've seen, but I think it encapsulates something very important about the sector. That the fix to this issue that I just mentioned is a very simple one, right? It doesn't cost a lot of money to implement a timer on their interface, but the company has no incentive to implement that fix. And that's because these jobs are very de-skilled jobs, they're commodified jobs, they're highly surveilled jobs, they're algorithmically managed jobs, and a result of all of this, they're traded in what you can think about as a planetary or a global labor market. And so in this global labor market, in this planetary labor market, this pushes wages, this pushes working conditions constantly downwards because the workers are so replaceable, because there's little or no incentive for companies to actually improve anything. Now, I've spoken to ministers, I've spoken to high-level government figures around the world, in places like Kenya and the Philippines, where a lot of these jobs are done, and they will just straight up tell you that their priority is the quantity rather than the quality of these jobs. They know that if they make life too difficult for the companies that host these jobs, those jobs will just very quickly flow to another part of the world. So it's the classic bad job or no job problem. And even though the vast majority of workers doing these jobs are unorganized, it has been inspiring seeing in different parts of the world ways in which workers who've had enough, who want to improve their jobs, attempt to build collective power, attempt to do that in whatever way they can. And so I've sat down with these workers who are trying to organize, some in Nairobi, for instance, and watched how they tried to build a union. The problem is that whilst they're building this collective structure, the jobs that they were trying to improve, they moved to Ghana the minute they created too much trouble for this company. So this is kind of a wicked problem, right? AI involves human labor. The production networks of AI exploit human labor in the global south, but because of this global planetary labor market that these jobs are traded in, actors all around the world have very limited power to improve them. So where does that leave us? Well, for us, the key takeaway is that attempts to improve working conditions in AI supply chains, they can't just begin at the point of production, upstream in the chain. They need to also involve the lead firms in these supply chains, who are predominantly located in the global north. So these lead firms, they have the leverage to enforce or push better labor standards across their supply chains. They've got the power to govern their supply chains in a way that enables suppliers to raise employment standards. But how can we make those lead firms in AI care about this? Well, we think there's currently 3 developments that should make AI companies care about labor standards in the supply chain, because they pose risk to those companies themselves. So first of all, there's more and more regulations from governments and international organizations coming up that require companies exercising due diligence in their supply chain. So, for instance, the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive as a very prominent example of this, forcing companies to engage in this due diligence process upstream in their chain. Second, driven by numerous studies and news pieces, the public disclosure of these labor issues in AI supply chains, it's becoming a risk to the company's reputation themselves. And then finally, bad working conditions. That just poses a risk to companies as workforce dissatisfaction and conflict can disrupt operations that can delay projects or decrease quality. So all of these developments, they put public and political pressure on AI companies to act and get involved in labor standards in their supply chains in order to avoid these risks. So in light of this situation, what we believe is to move forward, AI, any company developing AI and their supply chain partners, they need robust benchmarks, they need trustworthy benchmarks and guidelines that can guide their efforts to exercise due diligence and improve working conditions in the whole AI supply chain. And that's where we bring the Fairwork project in. So I'll hand over to Patrick to tell you a bit more about that.
All right, so I think Manza already mentioned that we are a global action research network hosted by the Oxford Internet Institute of the University of Oxford and the Berlin Social Science Center. Is that loud enough? Yeah? Okay. Not really? Okay, I really have to scream. Okay, so over the last years, we basically got funding from the Germany's Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development and the GIZ to develop a universal rating system for working conditions in the digital economy. And this is what we did, basically. So the framework consists of 5 universal principles: it's fair pay, fair conditions, fair contracts, fair management, and fair representation. And each of these principles has 2 thresholds that we operationalize by a set of key indicators. So we use this framework to actually rate and rank working conditions for digital companies, or companies in the digital economy. And as a result, every company gets a scorecard like that, with a score from 0 to 10. On the one hand, to assess their performance and the working conditions, but also to encourage them to embed at least basic principles of decent work into their operations. The scorecards do not only make differences in management visible, so if we compare them based on this benchmark, they also serve as a benchmark for best practices that we can highlight, and then we use these scorecards to engage with the companies and push for better working conditions. We have applied this framework over the last 8 years to more than 800 companies in 41 countries, and including some of the most important providers for data work and AI supply chains. Some of the scorecards that you can see here on the slide, it's rather small, but I hope you can at least see the scores, the final scores, maybe not each threshold, but at least the final scores. By engaging with the companies with these ratings, we have created more than 400 positive changes to these processes and business practices that benefited more than 16 million workers in the digital economy. And one of the most important learnings when doing these ratings was actually when we talked to companies like Sama, Humans on the Loop, or also Appen, was that even the companies that we scored that wanted to make improvements to working conditions, they said, well, there's relatively little that we can do. There are severe constraints that are pushed onto them by the suppliers, the buyers in the chains, that they cannot circumvent. So they have very little leverage to actually improve working conditions here, and relatively little bargaining power vis-a-vis the buyers in the supply chains. And because most of these data work providers aren't consumer-facing brands, like the lead firms in the supply chains who are facing the customer, basically, the suppliers are simply competing on price, quality, on speed, and they aren't competing on decent work. For that reason, we basically decided, when we thought about how can we improve our impact, how can we move forward with the Fairwork project, we thought that it's, in order to bring about fair work in AI supply chains, we are thinking about more than just scoring the suppliers that we did in the last years. So it's the buyers who have the power to impose decent standards in their chains, and they can do this through the supply agreements and their procurement processes. So we have developed what we call our certification scheme, based on the evaluations and the scorecards that we have in our portfolio, to work with the lead firms who develop AI and digital tools and services to certify them through a process in which we work with these companies to embed minimum standards into their supply chains and to score their suppliers' adherence to these principles that we developed. If we look at a pretty standard due diligence cycle. This is based on OECD recommendations for that purpose. We can see how Fairwork actually supports and contributes to each of these 4 phases that you can see here on the slide. So if it all starts with risk assessment, so lead firms need to be aware of the risks prevalent in their supply chains. And what we hear from these companies very often is that they don't have a clear idea what their supply chain actually looks like. So they don't even have a clear map of who their suppliers actually are. There's different departments engaging with different companies. So this is pretty opaque. So the scorecard can help here by mapping the supply chains. We can map the suppliers in the chain, and we can benchmark and assess the suppliers, indicating the major risk in the supply chain. Then, based on the industry expertise that we have over the last years, we are also happy to and able to provide a contribution to the risk mitigation plans after the initial risk assessment. So when we think about how we can improve stuff, we can also provide recommendations to come up with these plans. Then the scorecards, if we do that over a certain amount of time, we do annual ratings, we can also monitor the implementation of these mitigation plans and see whether they're effective or not. And since our work is basically done according to highest academic standards, the resources that we provide can also be used for the documentation and the reporting duties that are usually part of these due diligence obligations. Okay, to sum up, I'll hand back over to Mark.
Thanks, Patrick. Let me just sum us up. So the point of what we're really, our main message here is that there's nothing immaterial about AI. It's not abstract, it's not magic, it's built on real human labor. And right now, too much of that labor is hidden. It's replaceable, it's disposable. The structure of the global supply chains that all of this work is traded in, it pushes standards down. It creates a huge number of harms for workers. But supply chains are governed, and they're governed by lead firms. So the question is not whether conditions can improve. The question is whether the firms that profit from AI are willing or able to use their power to make that happen. Now, global labor standards and due diligence frameworks, they're setting the direction of travel, but translating these principles and translating these standards into real operational decisions, it's still sort of a low priority for a lot of organizations. And so this is precisely the space where we see this sort of certification contributing by providing benchmarks, by providing ratings, by providing engagement processes that make these standards measurable and comparable and implementable across supply chains. So if all of us are serious about responsible AI, then we can't forget about labor standards. Labor standards can't just be an afterthought. They need to be built into the very system itself. So what I'd like to do is then invite the panel in the following discussion to just reflect on this, to reflect on what role standards, global standards like the Fairwork framework, can play in strengthening governance mechanisms, and what else is needed alongside them. So I'll stop here. I look forward to the discussion, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark and Patrick. Before we start the panel discussion, I'll briefly introduce our 2 panelists. To begin with, we have Dr. Saryu Natarajan, who is the founder of UP Institute, working at the intersection of technology, equity, and governance in India. We also have Professor Balaji, who is a professor at IIIT Bangalore and also the co-founder of Institute's Center for Information Technology and Public Policy. He is also the principal investigator for Fairwork India, whose work spans economic geography, global productions, and the political economy of technological change. Thank you so much, Saryu and Balaji, for joining us today. So, I will be trying to moderate it before time. We have 20 minutes, as I can see. I can quickly start with a very foundational question on what do standards actually govern? And my first question will be towards the Fairwork team, Mark and Patrick. Based on your experience of building the certification, based on your experience of building the certification scheme, can you really talk about how could this realistically change our AI supply chain, and what are the visible limits as per you? Over to you.
Thanks, Manzo. Can everyone hear me okay with this mic? Great. Okay, so I think, that is the big question, is what role something like this can actually play. And I think what's really important to stress is that something like this, a certification, should absolutely never, in no circumstances, be a substitute for real regulation with teeth. But some of the problem that we're grappling with is what we tried to discuss in the presentation, that when you have jobs that are traded, that are highly commodified, that are traded in this planetary labor market, where it's very easy for jobs to flow from one place to another, the hands of regulators are very significantly tied in the countries that host a lot of these jobs. As I said earlier, your choice is sort of bad jobs or no jobs, really, when you're dealing with this highly commodified work. And so, and like I said earlier too, there's examples of workers trying to organize, workers trying to create this sort of countervailing collective power to improve the standards of their jobs, and same exact problem, which is the minute you make life too difficult for these companies, they've got no interest in keeping these jobs in one place versus another place. They can quickly flow to the other side of the world. And so that's the space that we're trying to create this sort of pressure in, this sort of certification scheme, not in any way to try and say, well, we absolutely don't need regulation. We do, and in a perfect world, there would be minimum standards enshrined into law to protect workers from a lot of the harms that we see in the sector. But in the absence of that, that's why we see a need for this sort of certification to fill in the gaps in this absence. Thank you, Mark.
Saryu, if I can come to you from your experience of working in the Indian policy and research perspective, which labor issues do you think becomes legible within standards framework? And most importantly, which dimensions of labor risk remain invisible or depoliticized?
Yeah, thank you. That's a tough one. I think we've been following the Fairwork and the certification work for many, many years now. There are, of course, aspects of labor work that are captured. I suppose there are two ways to look at it. One is to think of the thematics or the domains of labor that can be captured through certification. This is health and safety. This could be wages, pay, working conditions in some senses, etc. There's another way to think about what is legible to quantitative and measurement systems. And I think the caveat in linking to the second part of the question around what cannot be measured or what sort of gets invisibilized, it is that certification systems only measure what can be measured. And it is data that is quantifiable, data that is visible, and data that is legible. So it is information, material, data that meets these standards that can then feed into certification. But Mark's presentation pointed out, and there's enormous literature, including some that we've done on data annotation, that talks to a variety of conditions that surround what are sometimes symptomatized by working conditions and pay. These relate to lack of dignity, these relate to a lack of agency in the platforms that people are working on. It relates to working conditions. It also relates to certain tasks that are quite central to the making of AI. So to think of certification systems, and I absolutely resonate that the argument that it cannot be the end point and it is a starting point, but one must be cognizant that certification systems do not necessarily measure what cannot be quantified. What cannot be seen as either a binary or a categorical variable are things that do not necessarily make it to certification systems. So there's, of course, two ways to think about it. Can we think about more complicated, compound ways to do certification, which is one part of the question. The other is to always be cognizant that certification is a heuristic, it's an indicator. What is really required is a deeper dive and more deep engagement with firms and organizations that are doing various elements of platform work. So I'll pause here and hopefully there's more time. Yeah.
No, we have time. So you mentioned about deeper engagement with policymakers or firms here. So I will now look towards Balaji. Based on, again, your experience of the policy advocacy work you have been doing for quite some time now, if you can share what aspects of labor standards do you think are taken seriously by firms and even policymakers? You can talk about your experience of working with the Karnataka state government as well. But yeah, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So, as part of Fairwork India, I've led this project for 6 years, spoken to all the sort of the biggest platforms in the country. I think a couple of things really stand out. platforms will not accept standards unless they are mandated. There's absolutely no two ways about that. Okay, and to the extent that they're even willing to accept any standards, it's going to be only if those standards sort of affect a sort of a broader public or a broader community. For example, to give you a very simple example, Mark talked about the invisibilization of labor. These apply even to labor when it is very visible, when things are being delivered at your doorstep. You don't understand the sort of the intangibles, the kind of standards that are not at work that might change their lives in some way or the other. So, for instance, the platforms might accept, say, some kind of traffic regulations because that's more broadly mandated when it comes to delivery. But over and above that, on their own, they're not going to do it. Now, there are some platforms that actually are willing to accept voluntary standards. But our experience over the last few years has also shown that these standards are often gamed and operationalized in very specific ways. Now, let me give you a concrete example in this regard. So, many or a few platforms actually give insurance and other benefits to their workers, right? But then this is turned into a gaming scheme. How? They say we'll give you higher benefits if you're a more efficient worker. Who defines efficiency? It's the platform. So essentially, it turns into a rat race within the sort of the platform's own workforce. So you're saying I'm going to get more insurance benefit for myself as opposed to her, although we're working for the same platform and you're supposed to get these as a sort of a floor, right? There's nothing like that. So these things are operationalized on the basis of convenience. There's absolutely no standard. Interestingly enough, many platforms actually blame technology, right, despite their deployment. They'd say, oh, AI, we can't standardize that. If these decisions are made, this is something like a black box technology we don't quite understand, right? So essentially, it becomes a sort of a merry-go-round. You don't know, everybody's pointing fingers. The platforms are pointing fingers to the technology, and the technology seems to work in its own mystical ways. So we don't, and on top of that, even within the sort of the visible platform economy, there's a lot of subcontracting that goes on. And platforms simply, absolutely disown or take no responsibility for the companies that actually deliver their parcels or food or food parcels, whom they subtract these sort of deliveries to. So this is insofar as the platforms are concerned. On a policy level, I think what's true is that I think there's very little appetite as yet to enforce any kind of standards, or ultimately, if the state is going to do it, it has to be through regulation. There's not yet, we don't have anywhere close to the kind of appetite we need. Even the recently passed Code on Social Security, or the ones it was passed in 2020 but was formally accepted by the government 2 or 3 months ago, or the legislation in Karnataka, Rajasthan, etc. They only, what I would say, go after the low-hanging fruit, which is Social Security. A whole bunch of hard questions, working hours, how they're moderated, how they attract, right? All those things we've been completely silent on. So, and the state has not gone after that. Platforms are not going to accept it voluntarily. So I think we have a lot of work to do. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Balaji. So I'll connect with the last line. We have a lot of work to do. So that's next round, which is about from scope to movement. And also, sir, you talked about standards don't work in isolation. They move through procurement processes, research networks, advocacy, and policy frameworks. So now I'm looking at Patrick now, if this question is for you. Patrick, so if you can talk more about how do standards acquire influence? So if you can elaborate on that.
I think you can hear me now? Okay, yeah, perfect. So I think what we've seen, we said that we have created these 400 changes with the companies by just assigning the scores and just using the scorecards to create some transparency about the differences in working processes. And I think the key point was that the scores help, on the one hand, to benchmark performance, so we can give a clear picture to these companies how they compare to their competitors. But I think a second aspect is much more important. We also gave them something like a guideline that they could work towards. So the changes that we saw were companies trying to make some changes in order to get another point, to distinct themselves or to set themselves apart from the competitors. And they had a clear idea what they needed to do. So I think this is also something that standards are very relevant and good for, to showcase best practice and give a clear instruction to platforms. Okay, if you want to improve, this is something that you can start with. So not saying that 10 out of 10, as we said, it's basic minimum labor standard. It's not the best place to work. So this is open-ended. So if the moment you have 10 out of 10 doesn't mean you can stop and everything's done. It's more like it's a start to start that journey of continuous improvement of these working conditions. Think about what can we do together and what can we do to improve. And I think the standard is an important means here to guide the efforts of these companies, basically. I think you want to just press on.
Yep, please go ahead.
Thanks. If I could add something to that real quick, I think another very important way to think about standards is I always think about the example from in the UK. We have a foundation called the Living Wage Foundation, and what they do is they certify companies that pay a living wage, and they give them a badge saying this is a living wage employer. Now, them doing that in no way means that everyone gets a living wage or that somehow it's enshrined into law. There's maybe 5% of or less of companies that do this, but it shifts the whole debate. It's sort of set a standard, a target that is kind of certified. Companies can work to it, and it shifts even the debate about what the minimum wage should be. The minimum wage in the UK just went up substantially because it changes the whole debate about what is possible. You see all of these companies that are certified, that are doing something that a bit above and beyond what they're legally required to do, and then you see them be successful companies. It's not killed their business model. They're not all going out of business. So I think this kind of thing can really just showing the actual existence of these things can really shift what's possible.
Thank you, Mark. Saryu, I'm again looking at you, and you have talked about that standards cannot be silver bullets. Based on your experience again, how do you think we can effectively design these standards and certification through advocacy, and most importantly, how can they well received by the companies or policymakers so that it can be part of the institutional frameworks?
I think there's two parts to the question. One is sort of what are the inputs into standards, and then how do you take standards into the policy making discourse and hopefully into conversations around regulation. I'll try and answer in both parts. The inputs into standards, there are sort of two very clear pathways. One is, of course, research, both theoretical and empirical, that shines light, problematizes work, looks at what is distinctive, what is similar to other forms of work, and then is able to outline what normative or value-based conditions around this kind of work must be. That is essential. It is essential input to the idea of standards and flowing into regulation potentially. The second part, of course, is the community of actors that think more seriously about, I dare say, well-being. I know it has a little bit of a loose connotation, but think about this as a value system and not just as generating jobs or some of the more narrow narratives around work. And this advocacy ecosystem that is diverse by design is also a central actor. So having conversations, enabling sort of, I suppose, the give and take that is quite essential in the development and design of standards. With these two inputs, you have hopefully standards, you have an understanding of what society values as good work. But then the institutionalization is a tough pathway. There are sort of 3 or 4 things to think about. One is, I think Mark alluded to it, which is a tighter link between compliance with standards and actual market or user perception. I think the term is checkout line activism, which I like. But I don't know if it's immediately transferable into the domain that we're speaking of, but there is something there about a tighter link between the conditions in which a certain product or a service is produced and people's perceptions of it. I think there's a second one which I dare say must be considered quite seriously, which is around judicial pathways. What the courts are able to do in liberal democracy, at least, is translate traditional understandings into newer contexts. So the role of judicial actors in, moving the needle in a certain way is to be recognized and engaged with quite seriously. I think the third is, I keep coming back to this, and there's sort of a broader passion project around the need for research and the centrality of empirical understandings and theoretical conceptualizations around questions of standards. So I hope that tackled at least some parts of your very complex question, but maybe if we have time, we can come back to some of these themes.
Indeed it did. So talking of complex question, Balaji, this next question might be a bit complex and difficult for you on this. So looking at India's institutional landscape, you talked about how a few organizations or even states go for low-hanging fruits. What pattern of resistance or uptake, as well, if at all it is, do you have observed or you think it might happen?
So I think to answer this, you have to look at what the state's priorities are, right? First and foremost, that was what was alluded to earlier. There's a desperate effort to create work opportunities in an economy where we're simply not creating enough, right? So that's a top priority, right? The second thing, at the national level and at the state level, is this whole game of trying to attract more venture capital and investments, right? We need to go up the global league, and within the states of India, each state says, I got more money this year than last, or my neighbor, right? So between the need to sort of create work opportunities on one hand and this desperate race to attract investment, what we tend to forget are the quality of work opportunities that are being created in large measure because the firms that are being most successful in sort of attracting venture capital are these so-called unicorns that are glorified, many of which is actually these platform companies, right? So you have this sort of a state that is willing to actually turn a blind eye to this particular situation. Now that fits in very, very nicely into what platforms themselves are seeking in their effort to build these sort of large technological sort of infrastructures. All said and done, despite their squeezing labor, and that's the only phrase I can use, over the years, very few of them seem to have a business model that is able to make any money. There seems to be this continuous addiction to getting more and more venture capital. It's like froth on a nice cup of South Indian coffee or on beer, and that's what many of them seem to be floating on, right? So there's no sense that you're going to see light at the end of the day. So there's greater reliance on that. So if you don't want to upset the apple cart, you're going to have to continue to rely on venture capital. You're going to have the state saying, oh, we can't affect work-generating opportunities. Now, the other problem here is talking about the planetary dimension. A lot of this venture capital comes from abroad, right? Here, the local representatives of venture capital are simply taking very small chunks of these sort of people like CalPERS and all these giant venture capital investment funds, taking small portions of them, and they simply are told, this is the return on investment that we require. ESG be damned. Although there's a lot of rhetoric and what you might say ESG washing about how venture capital money is going to be deployed or needs to be deployed. So all these normative arguments are made. But none of that. So one way of actually thinking about this, apart from judicial activism, is actually think of how do we sort of, who's going to build the venture capital cat, which is largely keeping many of these companies afloat.
Thank you, Alaji.
Auth on coffee and beer, there's a Tamil phrase which is apt, Noranatyam, which means dance on foam. So yeah, just thought I'd jump in with that.
Thank you, Sergio. I know we have to be mindful of time as well. Last round of questions for all the panelists, and this is more towards, we realize that standards exist, but very few transform systems. So either Patrick or Mark, if you can answer this, what do you think are the leverage points on standards? How do they become consequential?
Yeah, thanks. I'd really like to take up something that Charles had said in your first response about the limits of certification. I think the most important point is about division of labor. So there are some things that certification schemes can do. There's something that governments can do very well. There's something that unions can do very well. And I think the challenge is to create a system where the linkages are done in a smart way. So for me, like one of the better examples of the recent years was actually the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Diligence Directive. It was just watered down a little bit. But the initial idea to have a system where basically the government requires companies to exercise that due diligence if they want to put products or services on the European market. So it does not only cover European companies, but all the companies who want to work in Europe, basically. And that required them to do these due diligence mechanisms. And then the standards come in to guide the company's efforts and so on and so forth. And at the same time, companies need to be transparent about what they do. They need to publish reports on the risk they identified. They need to report on the measures they implemented to fight these risks, actually. And that gives civil society organizations, union worker representatives, some leverage to hold these companies accountable against these standards. So I think this is a pretty good example. It doesn't have to be exactly like that. On state level, there might be other means. But it's about linking the different mechanisms and see if they can work together to make them the most powerful, basically. That's basically my main idea.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Quick question to you, Sergio. I know there's a lot to do on standards and certification, but if I can quickly ask you, what do you think is the realistic pathway for standards, especially to move from voluntary frameworks to regulatory integrations?
I think some part of what I said in the last round, which is thinking quite seriously about generating realistic contemporary evidence and having those loops between what we learn from research, what we learn from the field, into the policy making conversation. The second is, I dare say this feels a little bit reductive, but again, working quite hard on drawing a tighter link between the production of AI itself, the conditions in which AI is produced, and the decisions of consumers and users. There is evidence in other domains where this has been quite significant in driving, if not policy action or legislative action, meaningful market for better certified and better valued products, including in domains like privacy, garments, coffee. There's a whole range, and of course with certain critiques of it. I think these two pathways to institutionalize and thinking about the judiciary as an instrument of lawmaking. I'm a lawyer, and so perhaps it is my comfort zone, but thinking quite seriously about how to create legal decisions that act as precedent, particularly in liberal democratic contexts, even otherwise, that can be quite meaningful. So yeah, I'll pause.
Thank you. And the last question goes to Balaji. And I have seen you emphasize a lot about state capacity and the enforcement by the state. But in context like India, can standards in any way complement state regulation, or do you think they risk substituting it?
No, the state shouldn't be, the state should be mandating standards, right? That's the job of the state, and that will happen only when it becomes a political priority. I'll show you what it means not to have a political priority. Recently, the labor minister called the platforms and says, don't do 10-minute deliveries. Everybody nodded their heads and went home. There's absolutely no way of actually holding platforms responsible for giving workers a means to actually complain against them. No grievance redressal of any kind. This is travesty. This is not mandating regulations or standards. This is absolute travesty. So that is not political priority. A. B. Platforms must also see this as a source of competitive advantage. Right now, it's a zero-sum game. All these guys, the guys who run these platforms, I know many of them, they all go from one to the other. They all know how each one operates, and it's a race to the bottom. So they're not going to change their habits on their own without any push from the top. And this government has not yet shown seriousness on that front. Finally, a lot of the responsibility lies with people like us in the room as customers. What kind of demands are we making on platforms to make sure that their workers are subject to certain kinds of standards, and that they will not, we can preach till the cows come home, but it's the buck that counts, and the buck stops with us ultimately. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I've been asked to skip the Q&A, so unfortunately we won't be having any question and answer. Maybe we can meet outside and you can ask questions to the panelists. So thank you so much to all of our panelists here today who have joined and engaging so thoughtfully. And we have heard again and again that standards and certifications are not silver bullets, but in a world where production is becoming more and more transnational, but the regulation has to be national, so more and more push from the state more empirical research to complement to that. And as most importantly, as customers, what exactly are we ordering? What exactly are we driving for? That's most important here. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. And we hope this continues beyond this room. And again, a warm thank you everyone to being part of the panel again. Thank you everyone. Can I request panelists to be there? They want a group picture with you. Yeah.
I cannot believe I've never ran into either of you. I used to work at NASCOM Foundation and then Everest Group. I've been researching impact sourcing